Human trafficking is a tough subject that we don't talk about enough, but it's widespread. It's everywhere, including the Charleston area. And today we talk to a new nonprofit that is helping to spread awareness and help survivors.
This is Charleston Women Podcast, where you can meet like-minded, strong, independent, professional, and inspiring local women. This is Charleston Women Podcast.
And now we would like to welcome to the Charleston Women Podcast, Kat Wehunt. She is the Executive Director of the Formation Project. Kat, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. You know, we are going to talk about a very weighty topic today because this is what your nonprofit does, and that is human trafficking. And I just want to start with, having you define it and also the misconceptions, because I know a lot of us think it's not anything that happens around us. It's not something that happens here in Charleston, like it happens overseas, it happens elsewhere, but we're wrong, correct? Like it is happening everywhere.
Yes, human trafficking is happening in most cities and urban and rural communities. And I think the term itself can be a little misleading in human trafficking. And I think we also all think of a lot of what media has told us about what human trafficking looks like. So we picture the movie Taken, or we picture people being kidnapped and smuggled into the country illegally and sold in brothels and things like that. And although those things do happen, most of the people that we serve are born in America and raised in America, and they're being trafficked in their own communities, in their own towns and cities. And I think it's that traffic, you assume the movement of people, but you don't have to cross state lines to be trafficked, and you don't have to be kidnapped to be trafficked. And oftentimes most people are trafficked by somebody they know. So I think we're all been taught stranger danger, look out for the vans that are going to kidnap you. And we weren't taught what to do if you're trafficked by a family member or an intimate partner. And that's often what we see. And not even victims identify with the word human trafficking. Most of the time they're like, well, I wasn't chained to a bed or kidnapped or taken to another country, so I wasn't trafficked. But trafficking is the exchange of either sex or labor by the use of force, fraud, and coercion. So anybody above 18, there has to be force, fraud, or coercion present. Not all three, but any or. So just one of them to be trafficking.
Right. I'm looking at you for those people that are just listening and can't see you, but you're beautiful. You're saying this all with a smile. You seem so happy. But I see, your history and your biography, and you formed this nonprofit because you were trafficked from the ages of 14 to 17. How much can you tell us about your own story? Because I can't comprehend that.
Yeah, I was trafficked by a family member, an older relative. And I can never remember a time before sexual abuse. And so this relative was sexually abusing me and some family members from as far back as I can remember. And then at 14, it turned into trafficking, but I didn't identify with trafficking because I also thought, well, I wasn't handcuffed to a bed or kidnapped. And this was a relative, so I didn't realize it was wrong. And I also didn't realize it was trafficking. It was actually until I was working in the movement. I was sitting in a rape crisis training, and they were training on human trafficking. And I identified with a survivor of incest or molestation or rape, but I didn't think of myself as a victim of human trafficking. And so I was sitting through the training and I was like, oh, that's what happened to me.
So I don't know how much detail you want to go into, but that shift, what made it's all awful, horrific. Yeah. What made it become trafficking though?
Good question. So anyone under 18 cannot consent to commercial sex. And the difference between a 16-year-old who can legally consent to just having sex with somebody is the commercial aspect. And so anything of value in exchange is what commercial sex is. So if somebody makes you have sex for drugs, money, a safe place to stay, food, any of those things, it's that exchange of something of value that makes it commercial sex. So legally, under the definition, I wasn't getting anything of value, but my relative was. And so that's why it was human trafficking.
Podcast advertising is the new way to reach your best audience. Podcast advertising gives your business a voice of authority. Be heard. Advertise on one of our podcasts. Visit carolinapodcasts.com or call 843-345-7012.
You're listening to the Charleston Women Podcast.
How did you get out? How did you go through that? And you're here on the other side, not only like you seem okay, but now helping others. How did you end your cycle?
I have a really kind of privileged story that's about my escape. That's not, not everyone has this story, but at 17, my parents were split up. And so I was visiting my dad for summer vacations and holidays and weekend trips and things like that. And that's where I was experiencing the exploitation. And so at 17, I decided, when I was getting older, started to realize this isn't normal and this isn't happening in other homes. And so something's wrong here. Right. And I decided that if I never got to see my dad again, I just wouldn't go back because I wasn't going to be involved with this relative ever again. And so 17 was the last time that I saw him, and just was able to kind of choose not to go back.
Right. And I imagine there's been a lot of therapy on your road to recovery and to get through this.
Lots of hard work. Yeah.
Right.
I tell people that trafficking is hard, and it was hard, but recovery is definitely harder. You're like facing all of those hard things that you went through, and you're not numbing anymore. And so, it took a lot of hard work.
So at what point, I think a lot of times as human beings, we like shove things down inside and don't want to think about it or address it. So at what point were you able to take that horrible thing that happened to you and say, like, you know what, I'm going to make this my mission. Now I'm going to start this nonprofit and I'm going to help others. When did that change come?
So I got out of trafficking at 17. I didn't tell anybody about the abuse until 19, but I still didn't have language to put human trafficking to it. I was still identifying with like a survivor of sexual assault or childhood abuse. And it wasn't until I was 20 that I started volunteering at the Rape Crisis Center. Just because I think a crucial part of my healing was getting out of my mess and jumping into other people's messes.
Right.
And it was really healing for me to be able to do that and to be able to say all of the, there's no way to kind of amend for all of the atrocities that happen, but you can make it a gift to others, and you can say there's a reason that I went through this. And so that really helped me starting to be able to give back. And then when I identified that it was human trafficking, I started volunteering for a human trafficking org.
Right. Can we talk numbers for a second? Because, we talked briefly in the beginning how it's everywhere. How prevalent is this problem? I mean, there are people that we might know right now that are technically being trafficked and we have no idea.
Yes. So the National Human Trafficking Hotline estimates that there's 0.04% identified victims to actual victims out there. It's over $150 billion industry a year. And America's the second largest destination for commercial sex, and it's not legal here. So it's happening so much that the numbers aren't even backing it up. I think we're just now starting to share and spread awareness about what trafficking actually looks like in our communities. So we're identifying a little bit more is why you're seeing the numbers go up. I don't necessarily think that trafficking is happening more. I think that it's being seen, now. So the data is hard to have an exact number, but in 2018 in South Carolina, we identified close to 900 victims. And that's around the same number that Georgia identified, which were like the 20th most populous state. They're in the top 10. So we know we have a big problem here.
There's a lot more that aren't being identified in Georgia for sure. Let's talk about the Formation Project and what it is, what services you provide. What are you guys doing?
The Formation Project, obviously we're survivor led. And so when I started working in the field, I was working as a care coordinator. So I was providing direct services to survivors. And I was the only survivor that I knew of really working in the movement. And specifically, just one quick story, I was serving a young lady who I worked with for about 4 years, and she has had an incredible story overcoming a really bad heroin addiction, and getting out of a really bad exploitive situation. And she worked her butt off to get a job and become a supervisor. She got all 3 of her kids back and all of her ducks in a row. And then I got a call a couple of years later that she had OD'd and died. And it almost kind of took me out of the movement. I was like, how can I serve people if at the end of the day they feel like they don't have somebody to call and say, hey, I'm struggling, or I need help, or I'm thinking about using, can you come over? And I realized we were throwing services at people saying, you have food stamps? Check. You have a job? Check. You have a house? Check. You're good, right? And at the end of the day, there wasn't a community for people to fall back on and to have continued long-term support, right? And so that's kind of why I started the Formation Project, was to make sure that there was an org that was survivor-led and that was not just letting survivors use their voice to tell their stories, but to give them a seat at the table to lead initiatives and to develop policies and legislation and give us our feedback on what do you need and what is working, what's not working for you. And so we established in 2019, there were no service providers in the Tri-County area serving adult victims. And so that's what we do. We serve male and female labor trafficking and sex trafficking. We have a drop-in center that folks can come in at any time and get a shower and get access to resources or work on a resume or do laundry. We have an intense service coordination program, which is just individual case management. And then we also do crisis intervention, so helping people get out of exploitive situations.
Right. Are people finding you on their own, or someone sending them your way when they realize what the situation is?
A little bit of both. So initially we started by just training partners that vulnerable people they're serving vulnerable people. So Department of Mental Health and recovery centers, because we knew they were seeing survivors. And so we initially got a lot of referrals from there. But now as survivors are starting to make their way down trauma recovery, they're like, I have a friend. And so we're getting lots of self-referrals. And we also run an intervention program in the Alcanna Detention Center. So we've worked with a task force on implementing a questionnaire into their medical screening so we can flag people for victimization. And so we're offering them services as well, too.
Right. You mentioned flagging people for victimization. How, as a community, I have daughters. Anyone who doesn't have daughters but has girlfriends, female friends, what are signs that we should look for? Because, you said yourself you were in a situation that you didn't name as trafficking in the beginning, but how can we be more aware?
I think one thing that ties all victims, whether it's labor trafficking or sex trafficking, is vulnerabilities. Pimps are looking for vulnerable people to exploit. So the more vulnerabilities you're collecting, the more likely somebody will exploit those. So single parent families or marginalized community, people dealing with poverty or mental illness or drug addiction. And then I'm seeing lots of peer recruitment happening in schools and things like that. And so there's definitely red flags for if your kid has another cell phone or is starting to make money that you aren't sure where it's coming from, behavior problems. But I think the biggest, the most helpful thing, instead of identifying red flags, is having open and honest and tough conversations with your kids and the people that are your kids' friends and things like that. But being able to ask the hard questions would have saved me a lot of trouble. I was just waiting for somebody to tell me this is your body and nobody should take advantage of that, or you deserve a life free from violence. And just asking me some of those, has anyone ever made you, have sex for drugs, money, or anything of value? Just blatantly asking some of those questions would have been helpful for me to kind of just open the conversation up.
And that's so interesting because obviously that's not a question that comes up in everyday conversation. It's not nothing you say to someone. Wow.
No, but you can talk to kids as young as 5 about just, sexual abuse prevention, safe people versus unsafe people, or secrets versus surprises is something that we teach kids, right? Adults shouldn't ask you to keep secrets. Surprises are good, but they shouldn't ask you to keep secrets. or safe touch or bad pictures and things like that. You can start pretty young having those conversations with your kids. Yeah.
Are our kids getting this information in school, or are you still finding that it relies on the parents? Because obviously there's a gap somewhere.
There's definitely a gap. And I think they're not getting good education in schools around this subject. And so maybe they'll get the blanket health, class and things like that, but if they're not learning it from you, they're going to learn it from their peers, or they're going to learn it in an unsafe way online. So they're learning it from somebody for sure. It's just it's a matter of, is it the right information? Is it good information that's being taught?
Right. And you mentioned previously the peer recruitment, which is so scary that people within their schools are recruiting them. I can't fathom that either, wrap my head around that. Kat, how can we help? Do you need volunteers? Do you need money, like as a community, education? What is your biggest need right now? How can the Low Country help you?
Good question. We always need volunteers, so we cannot do everything alone, and we rely heavily on our volunteers to kind of help us with transportation and collecting donations and working on resumes with survivors. So if you'd like to sign up to volunteer, you can go on our website and sign up. But we're also looking for monthly support, $5, $10, just so that we can keep our commitment to survivors in just meeting their basic needs, paying for rent and groceries and real tangible needs. We also have our center that's open, and we serve the community. And so we've got to keep that open. So we're definitely looking for monthly donors as well.
Right. Obviously the pandemic has hurt so many nonprofits. Obviously you saw, I'm sure you had your own problems. Have you seen an increase in numbers with COVID? I mean, what's the change within the past year?
We've seen a huge increase in identification of survivors. We have right now 23 survivors last month that were referred to us, which before that we were getting 5 to 6 referrals a month. So the increase is drastic.
Why is that?
I think the awareness that we've done the past 2 years, we kind of focused on training, and lots of other orgs are identifying and starting to realize what trafficking looks like. So I think that's part of it. And it's kind of becoming a little bit of a bigger hot topic now. Like people are starting to pay attention. I think it's like one of the biggest, social justice issues of our time. But funding definitely was decreased with COVID. A lot of federal and state funding was cut and things like that. So.
Well, we're glad to see that you're still around, still helping people, and that your numbers of people that you're helping are growing, but that comes from awareness is wonderful. What's one takeaway that you want people to remember, whether it's watching for signs of this, maybe it's a misconception, anything that you really think that people, if they take one nugget away from the conversation, what do you want that to be?
I think that there are so many facets to getting involved. And so many different, anything that you need in your daily life, a survivor also needs dental care, a community of friends and people to rely on, work, reliable transportation. And there's so many different ways you can help. So if you are able to invest time to mentor young boys or young girls, or if you're able to financially, sow into an org that's around you that's serving vulnerable people, or even just learning more about trafficking and starting to have open conversations with people, raising awareness. Hey, this happens here. Did you know there were 33 survivors served, adults by the Formation Project this past year? That's super helpful because it's just getting the topic out there, and the more victims hopefully will be able to identify.
That's great. Well, we thank you for all that you do for our community. Your website is theformationproject.org. That's where people can go to find out more information, make donations, hopefully make that monthly commitment if you can. And anything else that I've missed before we go?
No, thank you so much for having me.
All right, Kat, thank you for your time. It's the Formation Project. You've been listening to Kat Wehunt on the Charleston Women Podcast.
Thanks for spending time with Charleston Women Podcast. Please like us and follow us on whatever platform you're using to access Charleston Women Podcast.